So today we're joined by Seth Erikson, Chief Mischief Maker, partner and best-selling author at Storify Agency, helping startups clearly communicate their value to the marketplace through storytelling. Great to have you on the Unified Brand podcast, Seth. It'd be good to learn a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Sure. Obviously, as you said, I'm the chief mischief maker, which basically means I'm the creative director for Storify Agency. Um, we mostly work with startups, kind of helping them tell the story of their brand and what they're trying to do and why you should pick them over somebody else. We mainly do that through developing a story with the client and then also helping build a website. The reason we focus on the website is because, you know, everybody's going to research you if they find out about you, whether they see an ad or talk to somebody, they're going to go to your website and want to learn more. And so we want to make sure that we're helping our clients communicate that story effectively through their website. And yeah, and like I said, so obviously we focus on storytelling, but we also, you know, have a little bit of a deeper understanding and as like the neuroscience of storytelling and how all those pieces kind of come together.
Cool. So where did your love of storytelling and helping startups come from?
Well, I worked with a venture capital firm back in mid 2000s and just kind of enjoyed the people that I was working with. There's a lot of interesting characters in the startup world. um, and The storytelling thing actually came about from a friend of mine who gave me a book called "Winning the Story Wars" by Jonas Sachs, and I read that book and was like, "This is amazing." And my friend gave it to me because he was like, "You always have a story. Every time I talk to you, you have a story to tell me about something." And he's like, "I think you're a storyteller. Like, you should learn more about it." And so I read that book and it was kind of like a light bulb went off. I was like, this totally makes sense. And from there, I read another 50 books on the topic of storytelling. And some of those books talked about neuroscience. And that's actually how I got interested in like, what are the studies of the scientific side of storytelling, right? Because most of us know that like if you tell a good story it'll engage people, but like what is actually going on in the brain when that happens and how does that all work? Kind of I was like I needed a peek behind the curtain to see what the wizard was doing.
Cool. So in terms of that, what is how does storytelling affect us, and what are the things that it does? Like you said, when you sort of peek behind the curtain, what did you find?
um so if a story touches you emotionally, it will move from short-term to long-term memory, so you're able to retain stories better in general. When there's an emotional component, a lot of times people will say, oh well, I'm going to tell a story, but it's really flat, there's no ups or downs, and then you kind of forget it. But if there's something that like grabs you, whether the emotion is positive or negative, it that is the mechanism that causes the story to move from short term to long term. So when you use storytelling, they've done a bunch of studies where people stood up, gave facts and figures, just kind of like off a PowerPoint, and then they had somebody stand up and give those same facts and figures, but wrap them into a story. And they found that the people who heard the story, their retention was about 80%, whereas the people who got the facts and figures just thrown at them like a PowerPoint presentation, their retention rate for the information was about 30%. So that's a pretty interesting thing, or it's a pretty important stat to take note of when you want to communicate the right way with people. But they also learned other things, like they had an experiment where they hooked up 500 or 1,000 people in an audience to machines to read their brain waves, and then they had a speaker stand up and tell a story, and the speaker's brain was hooked up to the machine as well. And what they found was over time, as the speaker told the story, the brainwaves with the storyteller and the audience actually started to synchronize on the machines. So there's things happening when you use storytelling that are at a much deeper level than what we even realized. Like we were like, yeah, people love stories. There's books, there's movies, there's plays. Like stories are all around us, but like to understand at a deeper level what's happening there is pretty interesting. Um, we also do this thing when we hear a story where we put ourselves in the story. We become the main character, right? We actually, and what's happening there is we're actually recreating a simulation of whatever the story is that we're seeing or being told or whatever. We're recreating it in our mind. Our mind is putting us in that story and then going, what would I do in this situation? And basically, it's a survival mechanism, right? How would I react if this thing happened to me or that thing happened to me? And a good example of this is, you might have um, a a friend or like a spouse or whatever that tells you a story, and then you go, well, did you do this? Right. And the reason you're asking, did you do this, is because you've already kind of run that simulation in your brain and went, I would have done this. So now I'm going to ask you if you did the thing that I thought you should do in this situation. It's because of that simulation. Um, the other thing that's interesting is the simulation also causes us to kind of um, not be present. So another good example of that is if you watch a movie and you're highly invested in the movie, you'll be like, oh, wow, that was 2 hours. I can't believe it. Where'd the time go? And it's because your brain was stuck in simulation mode while you were watching that movie or reading that book or whatever you were doing.
Wow. So in terms of if we relate that to sort of marketing, communications, and branding, I guess one of the things you were saying there about memory retention obviously is really important. It's crucial, and also if you're telling a story, what are some of the key points that startups and businesses need to think about when they're telling their story to get that across to their audience?
Well, there's a lot, but I'll boil it down for you. You need a problem, a solution, and a transformation. The problem actually isn't what people buy; they buy the transformation. So there's the old marketing adage: nobody buys a drill. They buy because they like drills. They buy drills because they need a hole, right? And so the idea is not only to so the the problem is basically like, why does your business exist, right? We do plumbing, we do construction, we do this thing, that thing, right? That's the problem. So somebody's coming to you going, I have this problem, and by you saying this is the problem we fix, you at least get to a level of understanding with your customer where they're like, okay, I think they can fix my problem, right? Then you offer your product or service as the solution. Then what you need to have on the other side of that is, and when you do this thing with me, here's all the great benefits that you're going to get. That's actually what people are buying, right? They're like, yes, my arm's broken. I know you're a doctor, but is it going to heal correctly? Right? Am I going to be able to use this arm again in the future to throw a football? Like that's what they want to know, right? So you can break down any story or at least a simple marketing message into problem, solution, and transformation, and then really kind of like focus on the transformation and what they're going to get. And that is the simplest way to do it. Otherwise, you can tell bigger stories definitely in marketing, but it takes more time. And that's when you start getting into things like the hero's journey and the 15 steps and the magic elixir and the inciting incident. And like, but that'll just, I'll drone on about that for an hour. So
Cool. So in terms of storytelling for startups, so we just touched on some points there and some things people can do. What are some things that people get wrong with storytelling for startups? What are some things they do in terms of not communicating the right story?
well, the biggest one is not knowing your audience, right? So let's say you're a, Manchester United fan, and I'm trying to sell you, um, West Ham soccer gear, right? Or football gear. It wouldn't make sense, right? And so sometimes not understanding your audience causes you to tell the wrong story because you don't really understand their pain at a deeper level. Um, and when you don't like show that you understand people's pain at a deeper level, um, and you just say surface stuff, people go, okay, well, everybody says that. That's kind of the same, and I don't really know how to evaluate you from this other person. Um, so part of it is understanding your audience, understanding what the real pain is. The other part is going deeper with that pain at an expert level. So an example of this is um, I was talking to somebody who does psychology, and they basically said, we have the story, and it's, we think it's pretty good. And I said, okay, so they told me what they had, and I said, okay, but everything's at a surface level. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, this whole thing is about stress, right? And they said, yeah. I said, what does stress do? Well, it causes anxiety, it causes a breakdown in relationships, it causes this thing, this thing, this thing. So they knew the answer to go deeper, but they weren't talking about it. They were like, come to us and get counseling for stress, right? And I'm like, no, you need to talk about how like stress causes your your relationships to fall apart, right? Because maybe you're fighting with your significant other or your friends or your children or whatever it might be. Like that's the deeper level of the problem that people really want to get solved, right? There's some issue beyond stress is just an indication that something's wrong, but there's the outcome of that stress, and that's what you need to be able to address when talking about a problem. So those are the two areas. One is just not understanding your audience, like knowing who they are, what they're interested in, what their real problem is, and then number two, drilling deeper into that real problem.